You are standing on a plain, grass as far as you can see in every direction. The sky is enormous, and then the ground starts to shake. Not from an earthquake, not from a storm, from them. You hear them before you see them, a low thunder, building from the horizon. And then the black wall appears, moving, breathing, alive. 60 million of them, the single largest gathering of land animals ever recorded on Earth. Early European travelers wrote in their journals that the herds looked like a dark ocean pouring over the hills, that you could hear them from 20 miles away, that it took 3 days to ride past a single herd. 60 million animals, covering the continent. Now I want you to think about something. If there were 60 million of them, why is there not a single bison burger at your local fast food restaurant? You grew up eating beef, chicken, pork. You have probably never once eaten buffalo in your life, and you probably never stopped to wonder why. Most people assume bison were too wild, too dangerous, too hard to work with, or maybe they just didn't taste good. But here's the thing, none of that is true. The real answer is one of the darkest stories on this continent, and it reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the food on your plate right now, about decisions that were made for you before you were ever born. Stay with me until the end, because the final part of this story is going to change how you look at every meal for the rest of your life. Here is what actually happened. North America. Before European contact, the American bison, also called the buffalo, was the most important animal on the continent. Not just important to a few people, central to everything. Imagine you are living on the Great Plains 1,000 years ago. There is no grocery store, no supply chain, no warehouse full of packaged food. There is only what the land gives you, and the land gave you the bison. You ate the meat. Fresh in summer, dried into strips for winter, pounded with fat and berries into a high-energy food called pemmican that could last for years. You used the hide for your home, for your blankets, for your clothes and your moccasins. You made tools from the bones, knives from the shoulder blades, sleds from the ribs, needles from the smaller bones. You made rope from the hair. You burned the dried dung for fuel on a treeless plain where wood was rare. You used the stomach as a cooking pot, the bladder as a water container, the tongue as a delicacy, the sinew as bowstring. Nothing was wasted. Anthropologists estimate the Plains tribes had over 100 distinct uses for a single bison. One animal, 100 uses. For thousands of years, the relationship between the native peoples of the Great Plains and the bison was one of the most sophisticated and sustainable food systems ever recorded in human history. 60 million animals, a continent in balance, a people who had perfected a way of living with the land. And then something arrived that would end all of it. But here's what's fascinating. It did not end slowly. It ended in 15 years. The 1870s. A new tanning process was developed in Europe. This technology could turn bison hide into industrial leather. Strong, flexible, perfect for the factory belts that ran every machine in the Industrial Revolution. And overnight, bison hide became one of the most valuable materials in the world. Hunters flooded onto the Great Plains from every direction. Professional killers armed with high-powered rifles that could drop a bison from 300 yards away. They worked in teams. One shooter, several skinners. The shooter would find a herd, pick a position, and fire, and fire, and fire. A skilled hunter could kill 100 bison in a single afternoon. They took the hides, just the hides. Everything else, the meat, the organs, the bones, the tongue, was left on the ground to rot. Imagine standing on the Kansas plains in 1873. The smell hits you before anything else. Thousands of carcasses stretching to the horizon in every direction, bloating in the July heat. Clouds of flies so thick they block the sun. Piles of bones that early settlers said looked like small hills. Travelers wrote that you could smell the plains from miles away during those years, and the killing didn't slow down, it sped up. In the peak years, hunters were shipping 3 million hides a year out of the southern plains alone. 3 million per year. And here's the number that should make you stop breathing for a second. In 1870, there were an estimated 30 million bison on the Great Plains. In 1889, just 19 years later, a man named William Temple Hornaday of the Smithsonian Institution conducted the most careful census anyone had attempted. He counted every known remaining wild bison in the United States. The number he came back with was 541, from 30 million to 541 in less than 2 decades. But here's what history class almost certainly never told you. The slaughter was not just business, it was policy. The United States Army knew exactly what was happening on the Great Plains. They watched it in real time, and they did not stop it. Some commanders actively encouraged it because they understood something that was brutal and simple and terrifyingly effective. Destroy the bison, and you destroy the Plains tribes. It was that direct. General Philip Sheridan, one of the most powerful military figures in the American West, stood before the Texas legislature in the 1870s and said that the buffalo hunters had done more to settle the Indian question than the entire U.S. Army had managed in 30 years. He said they should be given bronze medals, with a dead buffalo on one side and a discouraged Native American on the other. This is not rumor. This is documented. The bison were not hunted by accident. They were hunted as a weapon, to starve a people, to sever a civilization from its food source, to force tribes onto reservations by removing the one thing they needed to survive. And it worked. This is why you cannot walk into a McDonald's and order a bison burger. Not because buffalo tastes bad, not because it is dangerous, but because the population was demolished so completely, so deliberately, and so fast that it has never come close to recovering. But then, someone noticed, and it happened almost by accident. William Temple Hornaday was not a conservationist by training. He was a taxidermist, the chief taxidermist at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. In 1886, he was tasked with creating a bison exhibit for the museum. So he went out to find specimens, and he came back shaken. He had traveled across the same plains where millions of animals had roamed just a decade earlier, and he could barely find any. A few scattered individuals, a handful of herds in the most remote corners of the country. Where there had been a living sea of animals, there was now silence. Hornaday returned to Washington and did something unexpected. He became obsessed. He compiled every scrap of data he could find. Hunter reports, army records, trader accounts, eyewitness testimonies. He built the most complete picture anyone had ever assembled of what had happened. And in 1889, he published it. A monumental document titled The Extermination of the American Bison, published by the Smithsonian Institution. He named names. He laid out numbers. He described the methods. And he said, loudly and clearly, that if nothing changed, the American bison would be gone from the earth within years. Some people listened. Theodore Roosevelt had seen the same empty plains. As a rancher and a hunter, he had watched the herds vanish in real time. He and Hornaday became allies. In 1905, Hornaday helped found the American Bison Society. They established protected breeding herds, they moved animals into Yellowstone, they fenced reserves in Montana and Oklahoma and South Dakota, and slowly, almost impossibly slowly, the numbers began to rise. From 541 to 1,000 to 5,000 to 50,000. Today there are roughly 500,000 bison in North America, which sounds like a success story. Until you remember where they started. 500,000 is less than 1% of the original 60 million. And the vast majority of those animals are not wild. They live on private ranches. They are bred, managed, and fenced. They are not the thundering ocean that once covered the continent. They are survivors, living on a fraction of their original range. So, can you actually eat bison today? Here is where the story gets surprisingly strange. Because the answer is yes. You can eat bison. Bison meat is completely legal. It is USDA inspected. You can buy bison steaks, bison burgers, and bison jerky at specialty stores in most American cities. Nutritionally, it is extraordinary. Lower in fat than beef, higher in protein, rich in iron and omega-3 fatty acids. Some nutritionists consider it one of the most nutrient-dense red meats available. So why is it not everywhere? Why is there no bison at the drive-thru? Why did cattle become the default and bison stay the niche curiosity? And this is the part that quietly gets under your skin. Because the answer is, the market was already gone. When the bison were wiped out, the food infrastructure built around them collapsed too. The native nations who had managed the herds for thousands of years were forced onto reservations. The knowledge of how to live with bison was disrupted. And while the bison slowly clawed their way back from the edge of extinction, the American food system had already rebuilt itself around something else: cattle. Ranchers moved their longhorns onto the exact same land where bison had roamed. Meat packing plants rose across the Midwest. Supply chains grew. Supermarkets stocked beef. Restaurants built menus around it. An entire economy was wired for one animal. And bison, even as the numbers recovered, were left outside the system. They are harder to raise than cattle. They are not domesticated in the same way. They do not stay behind fences reliably. They are faster, more unpredictable, and more expensive to manage. The infrastructure for ranching them at scale simply never developed. So bison stayed expensive, stayed rare, stayed the kind of thing you see on a menu at a farm-to-table restaurant and think, oh, interesting, and maybe order once. But never the thing you grew up with. Never the default. Now, there is one more piece of this story, and most people never hear it. For the tribal nations of the Great Plains, the return of the bison is not a ranching question. It is not a market question. It is a healing question. For the Lakota, the Blackfoot, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the bison is not just an animal. It is woven into identity, into ceremony, into a worldview that was targeted as deliberately as the herds themselves. When the bison were killed, it was not just food that was lost. It was a way of seeing the world. A relationship with the land that had taken millennia to develop. In 1990, tribal nations began organizing to bring the bison back. The InterTribal Buffalo Council was founded, eventually representing over 80 tribes across 20 states. They now manage more than 20,000 bison on tribal lands. Not just for meat, for restoration, for cultural memory, for ceremony. The USDA has partnered with tribal nations on these programs. Because there is a growing understanding that you cannot separate the ecology from the history, you cannot restore the bison without reckoning with what was done to the people who cared for them. And when you buy bison meat from a tribal ranch today, you are participating in something that goes far beyond a meal. You are part of a recovery that has taken over a century. And that is still not finished. So here is the question that has been underneath all of this. Why do you eat what you eat? You probably grew up eating beef, chicken, pork, and it likely never crossed your mind to wonder why those three animals. Why not bison? Why not the animal that once dominated this continent? The one that was already perfectly adapted to the land, already abundant, already nutritious, already sustainable. But your food choices were not random. They were not natural. They were shaped deliberately and violently by decisions made 150 years ago, by industrial demand for leather, by a military strategy to break a people, by the economics of a cattle industry that filled the vacuum left behind. Beef is not the default because it is the best option. Beef is the default because it won a competition that bison were not allowed to participate in. Because bison were nearly erased before that competition even started. And the world you were born into was built on that erasure. Here is the part that stays with me. If Hornaday had not gone looking for specimens in 1886, if he had not been horrified by what he found, if he had not spent the rest of his life fighting for those animals, the bison would be gone, not nearly extinct, gone. And with them, the grasslands they shaped would have changed permanently. Because the bison did not just live on the Great Plains, they built it. Their grazing patterns kept the grasses healthy and diverse. Their hooves aerated the soil. Their wallowing created small depressions that collected rain and supported wetland plants. The prairie evolved alongside 60 million of them over thousands of years. Remove them, and the land begins to unravel. Ecologists documenting the Great Plains today are still measuring the damage done by their absence, and the early results from areas where bison have been reintroduced are remarkable. Soil health improving, grassland diversity returning, water retention increasing, the land remembers. It remembers what it grew up with, and it begins to come back to life when that thing returns. So, why can't we eat buffalo? The answer is not that we can't. The answer is that we almost didn't get the chance. 60 million animals reduced to 541 in less than 20 years. Not by drought, not by disease, by design, by greed, by a military strategy that used starvation as a weapon. And then the world moved on, built a new food system over the ruins, handed it to every generation that came after, and most of us walked into grocery stores our entire lives, reached for the beef, and never once thought to ask why. The bison is still here. Barely. Quietly grazing on a fraction of the land it once covered. Watched over by ranchers and tribal nations and conservationists who understand what nearly happened. And every time you stand in a grocery store aisle and see beef, and only beef, you are looking at the long shadow of something that was done on purpose. Something that changed what this continent sounds like, smells like, and eats. Something that changed you, without you ever knowing it. The real question is not why we can't eat buffalo. The real question is, who decided what would be on your plate? And what else was decided for you before you were ever born to question it?